Good afternoon, everyone. I think we can start. My name is Siziwe Nwabe. I am the operations lead for Africa Evidence Network. Thank you very much for joining us on this webinar. We're exploring EIDM capacity development delivery mechanisms. And also, most importantly, the AEN is celebrating its 10-year anniversary this year. So these conversations are coming really at a critical time and a very important time in the work that we do. Just to make sure that all of us, are able to enjoy the discussions and be able to participate in the discussions. I'll go through a few housekeeping rules that will make us and make the webinar easier to navigate. So I think as we continue with the discussions, we'll invite the participants to participate as much as possible. And this session will be recorded so that to make sure that if you did not attend or there are people that wanted to attend the session, the recording can be shared with them so they can also, be partakers of the discussions that have taken place today. We would like you to switch off your cameras, except for the panelists when they're doing the discussion, because at least it's easier to have them and see them during the discussions. And in case you have any technical issues, please send your message via the chat. And also, if you have any questions, we'll manage them via the chat. Please feel free to use the chat as much as possible during this webinar. I think also what is important, just to link these webinars, because this is our 7th webinar in the series. This started during Evidence 2020, when we drafted a manifesto with the working group during that year. And this manifesto is a declaration of all Africa's ecosystem about the kind of capacities we want to practice. And also, it is an Africa-led approach in enhancing our capacities in the continent. And also, it serves as a resource to inspire the work that is done around capacity development. And also, I think it's a tool that is used to challenge the mainstream views on capacity building in EIDM in the continent. And if you need more about the manifesto, it is published on the AEN website. Please take some time and look at it, and so that you are, abreast in terms of what we are talking about and why we're having this webinar series, to ensure that we keep these conversations open and we continue to work on this. And then just briefly about this series. We launched this series during Africa Evidence Week in 2021, and we're running this through 2022. So in July, we'll have our last webinar for 2022. And then also, what is important about this is more for us to share experiences and also enhance connections amongst ourselves and collaborate with one another, and not duplicate efforts, strengthen what is happening around the continent, because that's really a great way of making sure that we work together. And at this moment, I would like to hand over to Prof. Sandy, who is the moderator for this session. And I hope you really enjoy the discussions that are going to take place. And now, over to you, Prof. Sandy.
Thank you very much, Siziwe, for welcoming us all to this webinar. I'm really looking forward to the discussions about the different ways of enhancing the use of evidence mechanisms. These might be fellowships, communities of practice, mentoring, training, secondments, embedding researchers, or there may be a whole host of other things that we've not thought of yet. I'm delighted to have here 3 panel members from around the world. Dr. Aku Kwamie from the Alliance for Health Policy and Systems Research, Emily Hayter from On Think Tanks, and Mohammed Awal from the Ghana Center for Democratic Development. Aku Kwamie is a technical officer with the Alliance for Health Policy and Systems Research at WHO in Geneva. And she's a health systems researcher with an interest in applying complexity theory to health systems governance, management and leadership. Aku leads the Alliance's portfolios on systems thinking and capacity strengthening, where her work focuses on health policy and systems research, mentorship, evidence-informed decision-making capacities, and strengthening communities for researcher-practitioner exchanges. Emily Hayter has 14 years experience in international development, working at the intersections between research and public sector governance. And before joining On Think Tank, she spent 7 years at INASP, where as a senior program specialist, she headed a strand of work on research and evidence systems for policy and practice. And project roles have included advisory support for the Data for Accountability project, led by the African Centre for Parliamentary Affairs and funded by the Hewlett Foundation, lead of the Capacity Development Workstream in the Strengthening Evidence for Development Impact project, funded by FCDO, and lead of the Global Platform for Equitable Knowledge Ecosystems project, funded by CEDA, and management of the VACA-ECO Consortium under the Building Capacity for the Use of Research Evidence project, funded by DFID. Mohammed Awal is a senior research analyst at the Ghana Centre for Democratic Development, leading think tank that focuses on the promotion of free, peaceful and well-governed democracies in Ghana and Africa. Mohammed is the team leader for social accountability and the Sustainable Development Goals programme at CDD-Ghana. He leads there in designing and implementing evidence-based research, citizens' engagement interventions and government accountability and transparency initiatives to support the deepening of local democracy, social accountability and governance practices that focus inclusive development outcomes in Ghana. Mohammed's recent work focuses on improving the quality, accessibility and use of data and rigorous evidence to support policy and practice. He currently leads a team working on a project to understand what drives the use of evidence within government and using that understanding to implement, support and improve an evidence-informed approach to policy planning and programme implementation in selected local governments across Ghana. So we have a wealth of experience here to open the conversation. So I'd like to ask Aku Kwamie to tell us about the experiences that she's had and come across about enhancing capacities in evidence-informed decision-making. Over to you, Aku.
Thank you very much, Sandy, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. It's a wonderful opportunity to be here today. I wanted just to start by thanking the organizers for the session, and I'm really looking forward to exchanging and discussing with my co-panelists, but also learning from you. Let me also just say a word quickly about the Alliance, because many of you may know that the Alliance has had a standing strategic objective around supporting and facilitating the development of capacities around generation of research, dissemination and use of research for health policy and systems research, working both with decision makers, with researchers and other stakeholders. And so within our capacity portfolio, we have 3 streams of capacity work that we support. The first is really around the development of capacity products. And so many of you might be familiar with our readers on rapid review or on evidence synthesis. We also support several other kinds of mentorship programs. But for the sake of our conversation today, I wanted to focus on work that we've been supporting in our institutional capacity portfolio. Now, we have 2 projects that we've been funding over the past 3 years. And they both have different models of supporting capacities for evidence-informed decision-making. And that's really what I wanted to share with you today. The first model is a model that supports organizational mentorship. And so we've been working with what we call a mentor institution based at the Knowledge to Policy Center at the American University of Beirut, where over the past 3 years, they have been working with 6 mentee organizations spread across the world. But in Africa, the institution is based in Nigeria. It's the Africa Institute of Health Policy and Health Systems, based at Ebonyi State University. And so this has as its objective series of objectives really around supporting individual capacities for evidence-informed decision-making, supporting interactions between researchers and decision-makers, working to strengthen existing structures within both academic and policy organizations, and then looking at sustaining issues around incentives to support the institutionalization of these mechanisms. And we refer to that project as BIRD. The other project that we have is a different model. It's a model of embeddedness within ministries of health for evidence-informed decision-making. And here we've been jointly funding this work with Wellcome Trust, working with the African Institute for Development Policy, AFIDEP, based in Nairobi. And they have been leading a consortium of research and ministries of health in each of Kenya, Uganda, and Malawi. And that model has similar objectives to BIRD. We call this project high res, but the activities are quite different. So in the course of our discussion today, I'll be more than happy to go into the details of those activities, but it's been interesting to have these 2-3-year long-term projects that have really taken a different approach, but have really been looking at similar ways of strengthening both individual and institutional capacities for evidence-informed decision-making. Thanks, Sandy. Sandy, I believe you're still on mute.
Sorry, sorry. Thank you, Aku. I found that absolutely fascinating, and I hope we'll hear more about your institutional strengthening work. Emily, would you like to tell us about your experience on think tanks? Thank you.
Sure, thank you very much. Thanks to AEN for convening this. Also looking forward to the discussion. I wanted to say a quick word about OTT because this is my first time participating in an AEN discussion with my new hat on at OTT. So On Think Tanks is made up of 2 parts, and some of you might be familiar with the On Think Tanks platform that works with think tanks all over the world. And I'm working mainly with the consulting side, OTT Consulting, which offers services spanning research, learning, facilitation, strategy, and evaluation, and it partners with a wide range of different actors across evidence systems. So thanks for having me with this new hat on. Some of the experience I'll be sharing is more recent, but a lot of it is from my previous role in ASP. So I just wanted to outline quickly 4 different examples of capacity strengthening initiatives I've been involved in. And again, can go into more detail in the discussion. So these kind of build on each other, and I wanted to start with the kind of current one that I'm working on, and then move back from there. So the Data for Accountability project, which was mentioned in the intro, that's led by the African Centre for Parliamentary Affairs, and it takes a multidimensional view of capacity development. The aim is really to strengthen capacity to use data to monitor the SDGs within Parliament. So it looks at individual and institutional capacities within Parliament. And it also looks at a key kind of node in the evidence system, which is the relationship between Parliament and the Statistics Service. So what's unique about this project, I think, is that it is the first formal partnership between Parliament and the Stats Service, and the kind of peer learning approach that they've taken to the capacity development angle is really interesting, because Parliament researchers have trained the Statistics Service in how Parliament works, and the Statistics Service has trained the parliamentary researchers in data use. So it's been a really interesting peer learning model. Second thing that I wanted to share was the Strengthening Evidence for Development Impact project that was funded by FCDO, and unfortunately was a casualty of the FCDO aid cuts last year. So finished prematurely, but we did have some really interesting design and implementation underway before that program stopped. And what I wanted to share from that was that, in my experience, it was the project that had done the most thinking and effort around thinking and working politically, using applied political economy analysis, and also trying to take a really adaptive and learning focused approach to capacity development for evidence use. So I'd be really interested to hear from others on the panel or in the room if those are similar things that you're dealing with in your work and how you've addressed those, because we were starting, I think, to get some interesting questions in SETI. I wanted to share a third one, which was the Context Matters pilot that I was involved in a few years ago in partnership with the Ghana Environmental Protection Agency. And that one was interesting because it wasn't actually about capacity development in the title. It was about understanding contextual factors that affect evidence use, and then capacity kind of came up within that. So for me, that was a really useful way to look at the whole context and see capacity in that context. And it also took a really strong approach to organizational capacity, which has been one of the things I found interested in working in this area. The last one a while ago, which many people are familiar with, is the BCure program. And so I was involved in one of the consortia under BCure. And basically the aim of that was just to test what works in this space. And we learned loads, and many of the things that we learned and personally that I learned have been sort of taken on, I think, into other projects, and you can see them coming up in evaluations and in other project designs. So I'll stop there, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation with other panelists and with all the participants.
Thank you very much, Emily. I can see some overlaps and some differences. We're going to have a fascinating discussion. Mohammed, could you please tell us a bit about your work so that we can include that in our conversation now?
Sure, yeah. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever at all you are. Thank you for inviting me, particularly the organizers, for having this opportunity to share with the community of activists who are working to try and influence evidence use in government. I think that my organization at CDD-Ghana, we motto ourselves as bridging the gap between research and policy practice. And all of what we've done over the last 2 decades has actually been in trying to generate evidence and to build capacity around how this evidence can be used. And we've done quite a number of work around that. But our most recent work really focuses on the subnational level, at the district level, where for all of the interventions we've done, we've produced a number of evidence, but we see evidence is not being used to address the everyday problems that citizens face at the local level. And so in the last 2 or 3 years or so, we started a project we call Evidence for Development, E4D. And essentially what we seek to do with that project is to strengthen policy actors' capacity to be able to find evidence, to be able to analyze evidence, and to be able to bring it into policy decision-making processes. And we undertook a number of capacity development initiatives to try and further those objectives that we've undertaken. And particularly, we've done a number of trainings, we've set up communities of practice, we've set up mentorship programs that work with policy actors at the local level, and also the kinds of interactions that we think that are most useful to strengthen and to build community and systems that would find space in the decision-making processes where you are very inclusive in terms of who you bring in terms of what kinds of evidence do we produce that is fit for purpose, and how we can be able to overcome particularly the political context within which you bring evidence to decision-making processes at the local level. And one big objective for us is really the idea that a lot of this capacity building development effort has certainly focused on the national level. And you'll find national level ministries and government that are benefiting from this. But in terms of policy implementation, policy design at the local level, where really the lives of people matters, you would see a certain lack of attention to try and drive capacities, to enhance capacities to be able to use, particularly citizen-generated data, the scorecards, citizens' input, opinion surveys in decision-making processes. And that's where we thought we saw a niche and try to work in to influence the kinds of outcomes that we think that are most useful to drive evidence use within subnational level government. We'll talk more as we go ahead on the conversation in terms of some of the specific things and the ways in which we design our own capacity development interventions and the reasons why, and some of the lessons we've learned from some of the interventions that we piloted in some of the districts in Ghana.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. So thank you all panelists for giving us a start, a little taster for about mechanisms for developing capacities. And the things that I picked out that I would hope to learn more about is particularly the peer learning that I think has been mentioned either explicitly or implicitly by two speakers. And the thinking politically, also mentioned by a couple of you, and then what Mohammed talking about, building capacity at local level, which I'd be to hear more about. But maybe as panelists, you have questions that you'd like to pick up on or comment on from what each other said. Would somebody like to get the conversation going between you?
Yeah, for me, I think what comes up for me is the steady work that Emily talks about. I think it's unfortunate that the steady work got truncated. I think when we started our own work at the subnational level, I did have some interactions with some folks who were working on the steady project, and we were trying to think about the connections with the national level work, the sector level work that they are doing with what we're doing at the subnational level. And the idea about thinking and working politically to trying to understand the political economic conditions and constraints to how you bring evidence into policy, but most important, particularly understanding how civil society evidence, society-generated evidence can find space in the policy-making processes and what needs to be done for that. And I think there were quite a number of learning for us that particularly informed the way we approach our own work at a subnational level. I think their PEAs that they produced were quite front and center in our own thinking in the way that we were trying to model some of our capacity building training programs. Our own communities of practice that we established to understand that how do you overcome the organizational and institutional constraints to evidence use at the subnational level. We do have a political framework in terms of how governance is done at the subnational level. And the challenge is that we don't have a fully devolved system. And so you would understand that a lot of the things still happens at the center. But the challenges at the local level, you need to find local innovations to be able to address that. And the politics is one big element of it. How do you overcome this political space such that you bring in people who matters, who have holding power, and into the community for them to see the need to bring this evidence into decision making so that at least the kinds of decisions that are made are informed by a variety of evidence that are available, but also most importantly that there is some kind of embeddedness, a culture that is built around how you do that. And also how do you align your evidence to the interest of the political actors, right? You have a mayor, a local mayor who is appointed by the national president. He responds to the local political party. He responds to the national level political party manifesto. How do you generate evidence that responds to those such that you align his interest with this evidence and that it becomes the basis for informing decisions that improves inclusive outcomes that you seek? Those are quite very challenging for us. And I think that the PEA done by the SEDI project and the understanding that you need to bring in all the voices that matters, all the key stakeholders that matters were quite very key in our own thinking about what sort of capacity development mechanism should you adopt to bring in all of these people into the space.
Yeah, thank you, Mohammed. You mentioned communities of practice there. I wonder whether Aku would like to pick up on learning together with the ministries, or Emily, talk more about the peer learning that you mentioned.
Certainly, thank you. I mean, first of all, let me just take a step back to agree with Mohammed, the point about data and evidence and the culture and the values around that being needed at the local level is so important. And if I just refer to the project in Kenya, High-Res, one of the things that the colleagues have been able to do there is actually develop county level dashboards. And what these dashboards do, not across all of the counties at all, of course, but we're working in 6 counties, where the counties themselves have developed this dashboard, and they're using it to actually use local research and keeping it in a repository. What that does is it helps to change the value around evidence, because you're now using evidence that has been locally generated, it's locally relevant, it has not come from the national level, and so it is from within and for the county. And that then repository is also then existent to be able to validate with other international studies and such. But the utility and the use of it actually gets the evidence used. And it's in the use that the now values and the cultures around the evidence that we produce begin to change. We begin to now see that the evidence is useful. So I just wanted to agree, Mohammed, with you on that part, and shared this example from the Kenyan counties. I think more broadly on the issues of communities of practice, we at the Alliance have been developing over the past year or so a community of practice around systems thinking. And this is a broad, it's a global community of practice, but it really has grown out of work that we've been doing in 3 countries, in Timor-Leste, Botswana, and Pakistan, where we've been working with district health managers on how to integrate more systems thinking into their routine management work. And what we have found is that when we have actually just facilitated the time, giving people the time not only to use the systems thinking tools in their routine work, but also building in that reflection, that reflective time and that reflective practice. It really has been this peer-to-peer recognition. When one person has an aha moment, it is able to sort of circulate through the community of practice. That community of practice gets strengthened because confidences are increasing with every sort of experience. And so this is a community of practice that really has come from the district level in these countries that we're working with, and really has given us a framework to engage with different researchers, with different policymakers at different levels, with various systems thinking advocates, to really sort of build the science and practice of systems thinking. So communities of practice can be very important in that regard. The last thing I want to just say about this point is what the colleagues found was that the community of practice had a way of democratizing the work, because it was really as they engaged with one another, as they shared their learnings, even though there was external facilitation, there was really a sense that what they were coming up with and what they were sort of experimenting with really was being formed in this space that had been created by the community of practice. So we are still learning about, what else the community of practice is good for, but it certainly seems to be a mechanism that can facilitate learning, that can facilitate broader exchange, and that can increase or can have a democratizing influence.
Thank you. It's I love the imagery of that aha moment being shared through the community. That really brings it alive. Emily, do you have something to add on this, or to open up the conversation direction?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. A couple of things. Just wanted to come back to Mohammed on the CDD-PEAs. It's great to hear that you found those useful. And also I should flag that I think probably the one you mentioned you're drawing on was led by Asset in Ghana, who were the Ghana leads for CDD. And for anyone interested in reading the Uganda PEA, that was led by EPRC in Uganda, who many people will know, I think. So yeah, it was an interesting exercise to be part of. I think it was one of the biggest learnings of the BCure project, was to not take purely linear kind of technical approaches and to incorporate political economy analysis. There was absolutely no dissenting voices about the importance of incorporating political economy analysis. But I think once we actually got to the nuts and bolts of it, especially with my capacity development hat on, what exactly that means for capacity development, how you feed that in and when, and what it means for the decisions you take about whose capacity you're building and how you're going to approach that, then it becomes much more of a gray area. And I mean, that was exciting, but also challenging. I don't know if you had the same experience, but we had excellent reports and actually similar experience in the Data for Accountability project, where there's a comprehensive political economy analysis report, but then how you keep that alive, how you feed it in on an ongoing basis to decision making was something that you know requires working out. So I think that was one thing with it. And a second thing that we talked a lot about in SEDI, and be interested in how you saw this if you were looking at the reports, but was in how you link the broad kind of macro political context to the organizational context, both of which are critical for evidence use for different reasons, and you kind of can't have one without the other. So we really talked about how to knit those things together, and we drew on the Context Matters framework in some ways in doing that, which looks at all those aspects of context together. But yeah, it was a really interesting thing to be part of. And then on peer learning, I just wanted to pick up on Sandy's question there, bit of a pivot, but yeah, the Data for Accountability project does have a really interesting approach to peer learning for capacity development. And I think maybe the reason why there's been so much mileage out of that is because it's a new relationship, and learning about each other's work and just gaining knowledge about what does Parliament do, how does it work for the Stats Service, and then on the Parliament side, learning what does the Stats Service do, how are the key indicators come up with, and so on. Just that experience of gaining knowledge before you even get to gaining skills, that it's been a way of building trust in that relationship. And that's been an interesting learning aspect to come out. But one of the resources I wanted to mention on peer learning is the OECD convenes this group called the Effective Institutions Platform. I don't know if anyone else is part of it, but they have a really useful and interesting guide for using peer learning for institutional reform, which draws on the experience of CABRI and kind of PDIA approaches in different ways. So we found that quite useful in ASP when we were thinking about peer learning approaches, because it's a kind of adaptive, politically responsive approach to peer learning. So that's been helpful.
Thank you, Emily. I hope that after the webinar, we'll be able to pull some of these resources together so we can follow up and have more reflective time with our reading. So are there topics that anyone has touched on that you feel you'd like to pick up and explore a little bit more?
Yes, maybe I'll try it. I think this communities of practice stuff, I think in our work, it was quite front and center as a mechanism for capacity development and for resolving some of the institutional coordination challenges that are at the subnational level, because you have a myriad of organizations, decentralized departments that are not fully decentralized. They have different reporting lines to the center. And then you have a local government that is supposed to coordinate that, and the tensions and the fights in between that. And so one way to resolve those kinds of organizational problems was through a community of parties, where you then brought all of these guys in. We call it a whole of government approach to setting up a community of parties. And then you brought in civil society organizations that have been working with the district assemblies or the local government to form this kind of group and to have regular interactions facilitated by them, not us. They manage their own work plan. They come up with their own challenges, their own action plans to be able to resolve some of the institutional challenges they have internally outside of the national framework. Because if you have health and education sector that are reporting continuously to the center but not to the local, then if the local needs data, education data, health data to be able to inform the 4-year medium-term development plan, the reporting timelines are quite different, and there's always tension among them. We don't have the data, and so The planning unit in the local government then decide to cook up any kind of data and come up with a plan that in the end is not fit for purpose. So one of the things that we did through the community of practice was then to bring all of them in and say, look, can you continue to have interactions and understand how you produce data, when and how that data is available, and how you can bring that data into the policy making space. And one of our learnings is that it really improved, it built a community, it improved capacity, it strengthened the systems, the informal systems that they were able to put together to be able to resolve these coordination challenges that they have in terms of sharing data and bringing some level of accountability and oversight in the way in which the planning processes were being carried out at the local level. So for me, the community of practice was quite a very strong mechanism for us, both in building capacity, in incentivizing action, and in internalizing systems and processes that were sustainable. And in some of our districts, we found out that the action plans that were designed by the community of practice became quite embedded in the district medium-term development plan, such that resources were being allocated to continuously to be having these kinds of dialogue and regular interactions. And you have CSOs who also come in and say, what kind of data do you need? These are projects that we are doing. We are evaluating these policies. We are evaluating these programs. What kinds of questions are questions that you need answers to, so that we produce the evidence that is most useful for you when you are doing your annual reviews, your midterm reviews, your budget reviews, so that it can inform the decisions that we take going forward. And so the community of practice really was something that we had quite a number of learnings in, and we saw much more significant impact in the way it influences evidence use within the local governments that we were supporting on our project.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. It's good to know that there's so much energy and activity and innovation at the local level. And of course, I'm linking that with the regional and national level. That's quite a challenge too. Would other panel members like to pick up any of the issues that have been raised during the discussion so far?
I would, Sandy, please. Emily had raised a question, I think, for us, sort of around adaptive learning, and I actually wanted to come back to that and sort of maybe ask you, Emily. I want to hear a little bit more about sort of what you've been wrestling with, but if I just share some of the sort of broader reflections that we've been having, particularly from the high-res work, so the embedded model in ministries of health. Because what we've been finding is that we've been working, of course, with the theory of change and with a whole suite of different activities. So activities that have really been seeking to, on one hand, strengthen the existing structures within the ministries for evidence use. And so this has included things like getting the research technical working groups functional, developing terms of reference for them, devising evidence checklists. It's been integrating evidence dialogues into the annual work plans of the ministries. It's been training individuals, training focal research persons in rapid review skills and doing evidence synthesis, and now actually in-house developing knowledge products, so developing policy briefs that can then be used. So on and so forth, developing curriculum for evidence-informed decision-making. And as we now begin to articulate this theory of change, one of the things that we have been wrestling with is really around how do you capture the complexity of this suite of interventions? And what we have been aware of is the fact that even as these interventions have been sort of designed independently and have been introduced at different periods of time, there is something about them interacting with one another to actually give rise to the ultimate outcomes that we see. And so when we begin now to assess what's happening, there's something around the sequencing. Does it matter when you introduce which intervention first? Does the order of the interventions matter? And then there's the issue of repetition. If you repeat a particular intervention, what's the time that is needed for the capacities really to build? So as you're speaking about adaptive learning, I mean, we have now started to, in a very intentional ways, use systems thinking tools to try to explore some of that as we articulate this theory of change. And so I just wanted to sort of open that box, but hear more from you and others as well, because it seems to me that as we begin to really broaden the discussion around how do we assess capacity strengthening for evidence-informed decision-making, there's much to borrow from the complex evaluation field. And so I just wondered whether anyone had thoughts about that. Thanks.
Yeah, Emily, are you able to pick this up now?
Sure, I can tell you as far as we got in SETI with the technical toolbox. So SETI stopped just at the beginning of implementation. So we did a lot of this design and started, rolling it out. And very happy to share here or offline as well. So similar in the sense that we had a toolbox. We were calling it a toolbox of interventions because we know that there's lots of different ways that you can strengthen capacities at different levels. So we had this toolbox, and then the assumption was based on the unique context, both organizational and political, that had been assessed in each area, that toolbox would be deployed in a specific sequence or combination that was designed to meet the needs and the context of that particular either government agency or set of government agencies that had been pointed to through the PEA. So the idea was that the PEA would tell us which the key agencies were in that space and some clues about their organizational context, and then we would be going through an organizational assessment, kind of jointly facilitated organizational diagnostic assessment to pick out which of these problems needed to be front and center, where there was opportunity for change, basically. And then the interventions would sort of come in last once all of that co-definition had happened. And then there would be but exactly as you say, we had the same hunch, I think, that the sequencing of interventions, the combination of interventions, whether you go in with training and then do organizational work, or you go in with organizational work and then do training, is one of the things that came up in the BCure evaluation as well. And I think, as far as I remember, as far as BCure got on that was basically that the principle that it's a good thing to do all of them, rather than to just go in at one level, you need to have some kind of combination, but exactly how they interact is difficult to pin down. It's probably the same. I can see you both nodding. You're probably having exactly the same experience. So yeah, I mean, we I think thought about the same principles, but it sounds like high res has much more of an opportunity to learn through implementing those. So it really sounds like, one to watch for all of us to see how far you guys get with that and what your experience is. I also, sorry, wanted to use my 2 seconds just to throw in something that hasn't been raised yet, but I'd be really interested to hear from others, which is gender. So this is one of the things that we were about to start looking at in SETI, was we wanted to do a little review to figure out, within this capacity development for evidence use field, there's a kind of, or seems to have been an odd gap around gender. And for some reason, this particular field doesn't seem to have embraced gender sensitive approaches to capacity development maybe as much as others, but we weren't sure exactly why that was. And one of the things we were about to start doing when SETI stopped was trying to do a review with stakeholders in the sector to figure out why that was. So I'm sure that other panelists and participants will have experience there, but I'd be really interested to hear on that, because it doesn't tend to come up in these discussions as much as maybe it does in some others.
Can I ask one question before I let the others pick up that thing on gender? Emily, it was so frustrating to have done all that design work for your toolbox and then lose the funding for the implementation. Are there opportunities for other people to try piloting it? Is it something that is available, or is it still waiting to be ready?
The toolbox itself, I think, is the technical toolbox that we developed isn't publicly available. There's a lot of learning, though, that has been shared from as far as SETI got, which is on the Oxford Policy Management website. So OPM were the lead of that consortium. And so they have a lot of that on their website. And also for the African region, participants could look at the EPRC and the ASSET websites, because they were the national leads. So as much publicly available stuff as there is on those websites. But if anyone's interested in hearing about that capacity development technical model, I'm very happy to have kind of side chats about it if it can be useful to anyone. But we don't have anything publicly available specifically on the toolbox.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. That's really helpful. Do either of the other panelists want to pick up the issues about gender before I open the discussion to members of the audience?
No, for me, I think it's quite very brief. I certainly agree that in this work, gender hasn't featured quite very prominently. It hasn't come in conversations in the way we design our capacity building programs and so on and so forth. So it's something that here at CDD we've been thinking about it. How do you mainstream gender into some of these issues? And we are quite very conscious about it in terms of the kinds of support that you provide for policy actors, the issues and the kinds of evidence that is generated that is gender sensitive in itself. And so it's something that we are quite invested in going into the future in terms of once we do extend this project into a lot more districts, it's something that we need to focus on and to see where that leads us to. And so any resource that is helpful to sort of shape our thinking around this, I think is quite very welcome. And I think I'll get back to Emily on this so that we can discuss something more. And maybe we can all discuss it and share and see how we begin to learn on the kinds of things that we do around this capacity development effort on EIDM.
Yeah, I think a lot's going to happen after this webinar. Did you want to pick up on the gender debate?
Also, very briefly, just to add that it is a gap, and we don't know why. But just to add to what Mohammed said, I mean, yes, it's important that we need to look into the use of gender-sensitive evidence, but I think there's also the flip side to that, which is that are there different ways that evidence gets used by different genders? Are there different values around evidence use or evidence culture? And so I think that would be interesting to see as well. But absolutely, it's a gap, and I can only agree with Emily's point that the two domains do not really have seemed to have met, and it probably is an oversight.
I think in my personal experience, just ad hoc, there's also an issue about gender and generating the evidence in the first place. And certainly in the UK, it seemed like reviewing studies and synthesizing studies was a convenient task for women who were juggling work and children, and it was something that they could take on more readily than they could take on field work. But as soon as I progressed and met people who were more leaders in the field, suddenly it was all the men who were in charge. So although there were lots of women contributing to advances in making data available, somehow their influence was limited. Yeah. I think we have a couple of questions in the chat. So one question is how from Kirchhoffs, how are the different projects measuring change occurring from their interventions? And are there any changes being observed that can be shared? Would a member of the panel like to pick that up? Sorry, I'm just plugging in my phone. If you're still thinking about it, I can read out a couple of other questions and then you can...
Maybe I could try. I think in terms of our project and trying to measure change, we recently commissioned a summative evaluation of a sort to try and understand the impact of each of the capacity development delivery mechanisms that we deployed on the project. And I think there's been quite very good learning from it. The approach we adopted was more interactive, right? Met the beneficiaries, have more interactive conversation to understand where changes occurred and why those changes occurred. and what should be done to consolidate those kinds of changes. And I think that from that evaluation exercise, we did understand that yes, trainings are always useful, but trainings that are accompanied by some kind of mentorship and follow-ups to support application of knowledge acquired and gained is much more impactful than just one of kinds of trainings that you have. That, for example, if the communities of practice are well incentivized, if they are inclusive enough, they are much more likely to drive the kinds of institutional changes and to resolve coordination problems that you have. That, for example, if you mobilize a lot more voices, some kind of a whole of society approach to EIDM strengthening, it is much more impactful in ways that one-off mechanism would achieve for you. And so in a very small way, not quite very small way, we were able to find out what kinds of contributions did all of these interventions that we piloted in this district have contributed to in terms of strengthening approaches to evidence use within local government. And the question about sequencing, what do you do first? Do you do training, or you set up a community of practice and then within it you do that? Do you do peer-to-peer learning where you allow experience sharing across contexts, the learning that is derived from that? Those are things that we are still interrogating and assessing and what is most useful. At least we found out that the communities of practice were quite more active when we instituted them after the trainings, after their exposure to the issues, their challenges, the opportunities, and the capacities, and the usefulness of an EIDM approach to policy making was undertaken. And so you saw a lot more people were engaging, a lot more people were making references to that this is the way you should do policy making. You have to always have enough evidence that is on the issue, on the table, and then we have to decide and to bring in some level of accountability that we can be able to enforce. And so in terms of sequencing, that's one thing that we've learned that is most useful in our own work.
Thank you, Mohammed. I'm going to read out the two other questions, and then maybe the other panelists might decide which they'd like to pick up. So another question from Kirchhoffs. From the different interventions, can panelists recommend some mechanisms with contextual consideration, of course, over others? And in other words, what works better than what and in what contexts? So that's one question. And then the other question is from Fatima. In our experience, we found that co-production of evidence and evidence products with policymakers as a useful mode of building capacity. However, a key barrier was policymakers viewing researchers as the evidence generators and therefore were less motivated to build capacity. So that's two things to think about, what mechanisms work in different contexts and how policymakers see researchers. So Emily and Aku, would you like to pick up on either or both of those questions?
I can try and combine.
Okay, thank you.
Difficult question, Kershaw. In the one on what works, I think, difficult to answer. I can think of some things that don't work. I think one thing that definitely doesn't work is designing these kinds of interventions without the users. And I know we all know that, but it's surprising how often it still happens. I talk to people sometimes who say, oh, we have these great ideas about what policymakers should do, and we figured it all out. And then there isn't any actual policymaker involvement in that process of figuring it out. So I'm just saying it here again, in the sense that we do have an evidence base in this sector, which has clearly shown that that doesn't work. So that does still happen. And I think also sometimes we make kind of leaps in our capacity development theories of change. It's quite common to do an individual level intervention and assume that you're going to see organizational level change. And, projects might have all kinds of limitations, which mean they can't do full on institutional kind of organizational work. But I think it's just really important to be really clear in the theory of change what kind of change you're working towards. And if that's purely skills and knowledge, then that's fine, but don't then extrapolate and say it's going to overhaul the evidence system, which it can be tempting to do when we're doing training. And one other thing I think doesn't work is having an imbalance between the kind of thinking and the doing, because I do think to do good capacity development for evidence use, you need a really high quality of thought and conceptualization, but you also need a high quality of doing. And I don't think just doing the thought and then the doing kind of comes as an afterthought works. And likewise, it doesn't work to just dive in with implementation and not think about the context enough. So I think you need both of those things. And in some projects that I've been involved in, I think we've gone too far on one or the other. Either we spend loads of time thinking and then treat the implementation as an afterthought, or we spend loads of time implementing and treat the analysis as an afterthought. So I think trying to get those things even is really important. Yeah, the first point that I mentioned goes to Fatima's point as well about just it's interesting to see that, Fatima, and I think that kind of gulf that sometimes exists between users and producers in terms of what each thinks the other should do. It's not till you get everybody in a room and you hear that it kind of becomes apparent. And so what's one of the reasons why I think that whatever decision you make about those interventions, you're doing it in a joint space, because sometimes the joint space is further apart than we think it might be. So it's really important to invest in that kind of space. And it does take time, and it's difficult to quantify and it's difficult to measure and so on, but it's kind of a prerequisite for everything else to be effective. So I think resolving those kinds of differences that you're outlining, Fatuma, and providing at least space to start talking about them is really important. Sorry, Kershas, I've dodged your question, but I hope it gives a bit of useful context.
Yes, some really helpful insights and guidance, Emily. Thank you. Aku, is there something there you'd like to pick up on?
Yes, I wanted to add to the point that Emily has raised. And I think, you know, the question about what works in certain contexts is not just about the intervention, but it's also about the context. So again, if I just use high-res as an example, what we've seen is that in the 3 countries, even when the same intervention, I mean, of course, after a lot of consultation had happened with top management of the 3 ministries and a lot of needs and assets mapping took place. Once those interventions were sort of co-designed and implemented, we did see that there were different degrees of traction that the same intervention had in the 3 countries. And part of that has to do with the underlying or the pre-existing capacities that exist, not just within the individuals, but also within the organizations themselves. But also the pre-existing relationships. So we can see that, you know, in some of the settings where the pre-existing relationships were a little bit stronger than in other countries, they were able to get further down the line, and those interventions were able to get a little bit more traction. So in as much as when we are trying to answer this question about, you know, what's working for whom in what context, it's not just the intervention, but it's also the context. And to my second point, I think that when Emily speaks about the leaps that we make, it's really interesting for us to consider that, you know, as we are introducing interventions that target the individual level, and then we also introduce interventions that are targeting the organizational or the system level, we have to remember that there are interactions between the levels as those interventions are sort of evolving and adapting and changing and modulating in the overall system. And so it's not just enough for us when we are assessing, you know, whether we are just assessing the change that we see at the individual level or assessing the change at the organizational or even the system network level, but understanding that there's interactions that are happening between these levels as the capacities of those levels are sort of changing over time. And this just brings me back then to the earlier point we made about trying to bring in more systems thinking approaches to our evaluation of these complex interventions, and also giving ourselves enough time to actually find what it is that we are looking for. Thanks.
Thank you, Aku. There's so much to think about there.
Maybe if I'll react to a little bit, just something small on context. I think that what Elku said sort of brought back some experience we have of the 3 districts where we piloted our intervention. In terms of context, there were 2 districts that were older districts, and there was 1 district that was just a newly created district. It was just like about 6-7 years old. And we had the greatest impact in that district than these 2 other older districts. And we are trying to understand why. The intensity with which they had their community of practice meetings, the action plans that they were taking, how they were trying to embed some of the action plans in their own institutional and organizational plans and programs were quite phenomenal than what we had seen in other 2 districts. And so it's something that we are continuing to pursue to understand better. Why is that the case? What explains that? Why are these more older traditional local governments were not quite as forthcoming, interested, and trying to make the kinds of changes that we saw in the other newly created? So definitely context really matters, and we need to have a handle on really how context impacts a lot of the capacity development delivery mechanisms that we pilot in many of our districts.
Yeah, thank you, Mohammed, for adding that in. I just wonder whether the panelists have any suggestions for how the discussion might illuminate the manifesto for developing capacity for evidence-informed decision-making in Africa. This would be sort of like, you know, what are the little nuggets that we'd pull out and use and, you know, want to share? Maybe, have we had any aha moments?
Two things I can think of. I wonder, and maybe I'm going to reveal myself here, but I wonder, I don't think we currently have a thing for gaps or questions or kind of unresolved areas in the manifesto. So I wonder if it might be worth starting to note those down, things that we collectively in the sector are seeing as kind of, you know, meriting further exploration or kind of unresolved. One other thing I wonder is whether we can be specific about our recommendations or what we are calling on different groups of people to do, because it's such a rich network we have here. Some people are implementing these kinds of projects, some people are funding them, some people are researching them, some people are doing all of them. And I feel like there's probably some unique things that we might be calling on, for example, funders versus implementers versus researchers on this topic, you know, to do. So I wonder whether it could be worth, you know, outlining those at some point.
Yeah, very practical implications. Thank you, Emily. Aku, do you have something to suggest?
Certainly. Just as when Emily said gaps, my mind went to the word tensions, because I think that what I've heard a lot in this discussion today, which has been really rich, which is just about the balances and sort of striking that equilibrium when we're trying to support evidence-informed decision-making. So there is the tension between researchers versus decision makers. There is the tension between the technical versus the political. There is the tension between time versus, you know, immediate outcomes. There is the tension between the intermediate and the long-term outcomes. So I think just having some maybe clarity and maybe just some acceptance that, you know, within this field, this enterprise of trying to strengthen evidence-informed decision-making at those various levels, there are all these tensions that have to be at least surfaced if we're going to sort of, you know, address them in an equitable way.
Yeah, all that time for thinking and debate is going to be really important. Mohammed, do you have one last thought on?
No, just to add on to the laundry list shared by Aku, I think it's learning, right? I think we have to put a lot more investment on learning and what we are learning. I think it's most important, and how we approach this learning is certainly going to be very helpful in terms of our own understanding about how politics influences all of this process, how context influence all of this process, and what kinds of behaviors really are open to the kinds of changes that we want to see. And so investing in that kind of learning around some of the issues that the manifesto talks about is quite going to be very key. And I think that's where, for me, emphasis and effort and resources should be expended to try and give us a lot more understanding about what is happening around these interventions that we are trying to undertake.
Yeah, thank you. We've had one more comment in the chat, which I believe is from Harsha, saying, what an interesting observation regarding the argument for co-production. How important it is who initiates the strategy to co-produce. If the government and policymakers initiate it, the drivers are very different from when researchers and evidence producers initiate the process. So I think, you know, again, it's thinking about the implications of timing and the ordering of interactions that can make such huge difference. Well, thank you very much. I think we've had such a rich discussion here, and it's built on such huge experience. I, for one, will be going back and listening to this recording again, because I feel I need help in taking it all in. There's so much to learn, and I'm really looking forward to discussing the ideas that have been raised today with my colleagues in the peers partnership. That's the Partnership for Evidence and Equity in Responsive Social Systems, where I think we've probably got a mix of communities of practice of different shapes and sizes and different degrees of formality. And I think that theme of learning together and sharing the aha moments, it really resonates with me and how we work together in that partnership. So thank you very much, panel members. I am learning from you now, and I'm going to learn more when I have go back and listen to the recording. And I'm sure that everybody here is really grateful that the time that you've put in to discuss your work with us. Perhaps now it's time for me to hand over to Siziwe again.
Thank you very much, Prof. Sandy. Thank you very much to all our panelists, and I can see also the chat is being buzzing, and there was just one comment for Aku there. Someone wants to connect with you. They're looking for your email address. So I hope you don't mind if I share with them so that they get connected with you to further discuss with you as well. So thank you so much for this rich discussion. I'm really excited because this recording will be shared to all the AEN platforms, and also will pull together a blog on all these discussions that have just undertaken. And also I think I liked what Prof. Sandy said, to pull together the resources that you've just shared. Also, that will really be great. The email is coming to you to share all those resources so that you can share with our AEN members. And also I think this discussion is not ending here. We'll continue this discussion on LinkedIn. Please follow us on LinkedIn and continue the discussion with us. That will really be exciting as well. Just to say, one more webinar for this year, for this series, please join us. How do we measure impact on capacity development initiatives? It's happening on the 20th of July. So look forward for communications around it. Is one of those areas that are also exciting. And I think also when the series ends, it gives us an opportunity to reflect now on this series and what are the gaps that we want to close within the manifesto that we've developed, and what are the plans we have for 2023 to continue these discussions and ensure that we continue to share learning and collaborate with one another, because we're great at doing this if we work together. So I think from my side as well, thank you so much to you, the panelists. I think Dr. Aku and Mohammed are joining us maybe for the first time. So know that you are part of this family now. We will never let you go. So we'll always call on you for more information to share with us on collaborations and all of those things. That was really exciting to meet you today as well. Thank you to all our participants. It was really Great to see you again. So some familiar faces, some new ones. So I hope you've learned from this, but look out for the recording for more if you joined a bit later, and look out for the blog. So thank you so much for joining us and always being part of what the AEN is trying to do. And then lastly, look out for Evidence 2022 is coming. So look out for communications on how that event will work out as the AEN celebrates its 10 years. This is an amazing milestone year for us, and we're really excited. So thank you very much, everyone. See you on the next one. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thanks.